Hello, and welcome to Pollinator Partnerships Monarch Habitat Management and Technical Training webinar series. This series is an extension of the Monarch Wings across Eastern Broadleaf Forest program and is made possible with the support of the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and in partnership with multiple organizations and agencies. I'm your host, Elizabeth Kaufman, and I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Ed Spevak, whose presentation will cover monarch biology, designing monarch and native pollinator habitat, and native plant pollinator relationships. Dr. Ed Spevak is currently the curator of invertebrates at the St. Louis Zoo. Dr. Spevak has dedicated the last 40 years of his career to the conservation of invertebrates and vertebrates, working in zoos and aquariums as a zoo curator and a small population biologist. Ed is also the adjunct of the Association of Zoos and Aquariums Population Management Center, advising dozens of conservation breeding and reintroduction programs. Ed is the director of the St. Louis Zoo's Wild Care Institute for the Native Pollinator Conservation, or CNPC. He also serves as a program officer for the IUCN SSC Bumblebee Specialist Group, co-chairs the Bumblebee Task Force of the North American Pollinator Protection Campaign, and is on the steering committees of the Honeybee Health Coalition, the Keystone Monarch Collaborative, the Missourians for Monarchs Collaborative, and the Science Advisory Council of Field to Market. Through CNPC, Ed has also begun working with Native American tribes and nations through an initiative called Native Foods, Native Peoples, Native Pollinators. Thank you so much, Ed, for joining us today.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about monarch biology, what the requirements are. So talk about monarch habitat creation and management. So we really need to first talk about monarch biology. So monarchs, as many people know, are migratory, and we're going to be talking about that in a moment. They are actually easy to identify, both male and female. So when you're actually working in the field, you can actually identify your population and actually see, kind of a general idea of how your population's doing. Females are a little bit duller. The bright oranges, usually associated with the males, but most easily identified are, as you can see in the picture on the right, are those two black spots on the hind wings of the monarch male. This is where they actually release a pheromone and is an attractive to females. So it's actually relatively obvious. The wing venation is also a little bit less, as you can see, compared to the female. But the one thing about monarchs, as with a number of insects, they show complete metamorphosis. Complete metamorphosis are those stages going from egg to a larva, and in this particular case called a caterpillar, to a pupa, and within butterflies, that pupa is also called a chrysalis, and then finally the adult, often called an imago. The first thing that monarchs do, of course, for reproduction is laying eggs. The eggs are actually relatively easy to find once you look for their host plant. Milkweed is the only host plant for monarchs. It's the only thing that their caterpillars can eat, and we'll talk a little bit about milkweed in a moment. But monarchs usually lay single eggs, often on the underside of the leaves, but occasionally will also lay them even within the flower buds of the plant itself. They are relatively small, as you can see in this picture. However, they are very obvious. They have a slight conical shape to them and ridges running along, obvious. Oftentimes, if you do not see that original caterpillar, once they hatch, you can often find that first instar. Instars are the designation between the various life stages, the various sheds for the caterpillars. So this is a first instar caterpillar right near the floral bud of a milkweed. And if you look, you can see a series of small black dots. That's often the giveaway that there's a caterpillar present. That is the frass, or feces, of a caterpillar. But if you see feces, and as you can see in the one leaf that this caterpillar is on, you can see a hole chewed out of it. Look for those signs. If you don't see the egg, you can often find those signs of the caterpillar itself. The caterpillar, as I said, goes through various instars, the first instar being the smallest, the fifth instar being the largest. These are usually often the most obvious. There are only a couple species of butterfly that this caterpillar can actually be confused. One is the queen, which is often found in southern portions of the United States. The difference between the monarch and the queen, even though they are the same genus, they will have one additional set of what are often called tentacles or arms. Here you can see just 4 for the caterpillars, 2 coming off the head, 2 coming off the tail region. And then the other is the black swallowtail, which has a banding pattern somewhat similar, but black swallowtail caterpillars are found on their host plants, which are parsley, dill, fennel, wild carrot. So if you see a caterpillar like this on those plants, it's going to be black. On a milkweed, it is going to be a monarch. There is one butterfly that you can occasionally confuse with the adult monarch, and that is the viceroy. As you can see, it looks very similar, but the one obvious difference, when you look at the hind wing, you can see an additional secondary vein going across it, splitting the wing basically into two parts. That is very characteristic of the viceroy. So once you get used to that visual image between monarchs and viceroys, you should have no problem in seeing the difference between them. Now, as I said, the biggest issue that's coming up with monarchs is that they are migratory. So they go through a very long, elaborate migration from the Oyamel fir forests in central Mexico all the way up into southern Canada. And a large proportion of the population actually resides and breeds in what we commonly call the corn belt, or the corn and soybean belt of the central United States. Image, which is a compilation of various research, shows actually the proportion of monarchs produced in various parts of the range and those heading south to the Oyamel fir forest in Mexico. As you can see, the highest proportion of monarch reproduction occurs in the Midwest. Some estimates actually go up to 50%, depending on how you define the range. So how we work with monarchs in the central US is a major component of their survival. Now, what affects monarch populations are a variety of things. One is the destruction of the overwintering habitats in central Mexico. As those forests are cut down, or even as they are selectively logged, it changes the microclimate and it makes it more difficult for monarchs to overwinter. For you in a moment, their life cycle occurs throughout the year, but in various generations. So that overwintering stage is the longest lived portion of their life cycle. And if it becomes too wet or too cold, they have a hard time surviving. Loss of milkweed is one of the biggest issues because that is the only thing that the monarch caterpillars can eat. If there are no milkweed on the habitat, then there are not going to be any monarchs. Causes of the loss of milkweed and also other nectaring plants, uses of herbicide. There are various natural enemies, and this is one where when I talk to home gardeners in particular, they get concerned because they may see a monarch caterpillar and then they don't see it, but there are a host of predators from wasps to spiders to assassin bugs that feed on monarch caterpillars. Their goal is to produce as many offspring as possible that will allow the long-term survivability of the monarchs. Lack of other floral food resources, extreme weather events. If it is too cold, if it's too wet. For example, several years ago here in St. Louis, the spring came a little bit early and we had a large area of 6 different species of milkweed planted, and we had caterpillars on almost every single plant. It was early in the growing season and those milkweed were only 8 to 10 inches tall, so it would be very difficult. But then shortly thereafter, a cold and wet spell came through and really kind of decimated that particular local population. So when weather is inconsistent, when you have these extreme weather events, it can have a drastic effect on monarch populations. But as I said, one of the biggest threats are the loss of milkweed on the habitat. Pleasance and Oberhauser estimated in a paper in 2012 that there was a 58% decline of milkweed density in the American Midwest between 99 and 2010. And a lot of that is due to our changing agricultural practices, planting large monocultures, though this has happened for a while, and there has been a general decline in monarch populations. But what is happening is one of the preferred host plants, research that we've done a little bit here in St. Louis, but also out of Iowa State. Common milkweed is one of the more common host plants. The monarchs love to lay eggs, and caterpillars survive very well on them. Common milkweed, as I'll point out in a moment, is also a pioneer species. It likes disturbed habitat. What is agriculture but disturbed habitat? It did very well in these habitats. However, certain herbicides, and particularly, excuse me a second, certain herbicides are very effective at dealing with milkweed. So with an increase in use of glyphosate compared to other herbicides, there's been a general decline in milkweed across the central US. Now, the beautiful thing about milkweed is that there are a whole variety of species, and monarchs will actually utilize a large variety of species for egg laying or oviposition and for caterpillars. The preferred ones appear to be, in this particular area in the central US, common milkweed. As I said, this is a pioneer species. It likes disturbed habitat. Where you have areas which are becoming more stable, tall grass prairies, midgrass prairies, they will tend to be outcompeted by other species. But this is a really good hardy species. It also expands very readily. This is one reason why both farmers and even homeowners find it somewhat problematic, because it will expand its population by what are called stolons, kind of like rhizomes when you think of grasses. Just above the surface or just underneath the surface, an extension, and they basically, through clonal propagation, expand their population. It is also a fairly large species. It can be up to, say, 6 feet tall, very large leaves. So for some people, it can be obtrusive, but it is a great host plant. The other one, which is very commonly used by monarchs, are the swamp, marsh, or red milkweed, found in about the same range, a little bit broader. This is one which does not get as tall, and it also prefers a little bit wetter feet. So if you have habitat, or particularly riparian buffers, or even towards a rain garden, where it's going to be a little bit wetter, marsh milkweed is a good choice. It does not get as tall, often only about 4, maybe 5 feet tall maximum, but it is a very hardy species that does well in a variety of habitats. The milkweeds that I'm also bringing up here are those which are also readily in the Midwest area. We have around 30 different species of milkweed. One species is actually endangered, Mead's milkweed, but there are a number of available species through seed suppliers, through nurseries, that can be used for helping monarch populations. The third one, which is readily available, is butterfly weed. Butterfly weed, often seen along roadsides. This is a relatively lower growing species, usually only 2 to 3 feet tall. Orange in color, though sometimes you'll see populations, particularly in the south, with a yellow flower. A very good hardy species. Monarchs really do like this species. I personally find it a little more problematic for growing purposes because it is a little bit lower growing. If you do not have an open habitat, sometimes it can be outcompeted by other species of plants. World milkweed, and I show this one because it doesn't look like most milkweeds that people are used to. It has a very thin, slender leaf, almost looking like a pine. It is a very hardy species. For example, even in urban areas, it can do very well. I've even seen it actually grow into the cracks in sidewalks. It can be a very good, sturdy species, not very tall, but also one that monarchs really enjoy. Showy milkweed, kind of the western complement to the common milkweed, is about as large. Sometimes it can be confused with common milkweed, but it is also another large species with a good large leaf that allows a good food resource for monarch caterpillars. And then finally, Prairie or Sullivan's milkweed. And I point out just a few different varieties of milkweed because each of them likes slightly different habitats. Prairie or Sullivan's milkweed often likes a little bit drier environments, sometimes in calcareous areas, rocky areas. As I said, with marsh milkweed, it's a species that likes actually a little bit wetter feet, can tolerate partial shade. Common milkweed, disturbed habitat, full sun. Butterfly weed, as I mentioned, from my experience, can get outcompeted. So making sure that you have open habitat. But there are enough varieties of milkweed out there right now available that you can experiment with. And also by having a variety of species, each one is also going to bloom at a slightly different time. So it can support other pollinators very regularly because the blooms are actually going to be very supportive of both the monarchs, but then also for bees too. The one thing I also need to point out is that many people, when they think about monarchs, they only think of the milkweed. That is just the host plant. That is what the caterpillars require for their survival. However, the adults really require nectar plants. They require those nectar plants, particularly during the breeding season, to build up their energy. So when that milkweed is good and fresh, they will utilize the milkweed for nectar. It is a really good nectar producing plant. But one thing that people forget about oftentimes is that fall bloom period. That fall bloom period is when those monarchs are heading south. So things like blazing star, goldenrod, asters are incredibly important for that southward migration. So when you're designing monarch habitat or any pollinator habitat, you really want to look at large clumps or numerous individuals of flowers. Think of flowers as billboards or signposts. If you are traveling somewhere, you see a lot of billboards and signposts, you get reinforced that something's going to be happening or something to see. Similarly in the garden, if you only have one milkweed, the monarch might miss it. If you have several, they're going to see it. If you have a fair amount of goldenrod, asters, or blazing stars in the fall, they're going to be seeing that. Also, to maximize pollinator diversity, you really want to maximize the number of species, and you really want to look at the entire bloom time, spring, summer, and fall. So whether you're looking at just monarchs, when they're coming in the spring, that additional egg laying, those blooms are incredibly important. You will have a few residing in the summer, but then fall is incredibly important when they're heading south. So as I mentioned, the monarch has an annual cycle, but it's also a multi-generational cycle. So when you look at monarchs, those individuals, which are right now, over the last week or so, coming out of Mexico, out of their overwintering site, this is right now, we're looking at the end of March, so they're just coming out. They are going to be breeding in southern Texas. That generation then moves a little farther north. That next generation then moves a little farther north. Another generation moves a little farther north. To eventually you can have a fourth generation all the way up into Canada. So it's the great-great-grandchildren of those initial individuals which are actually returning. So it's not one monarch returning. And then occasionally you'll also have some reproduction in the fall. Here in the St. Louis area, we often get, particularly like in August, early September, some monarch reproduction of monarchs coming back through. They reproduce again, and that, which can be a fifth generation, then moves south into Mexico. I also want to mention there are other pollinators as part of this whole community. When we're looking at pollinator-plant relationships, we look and focus very heavily on monarchs, but we really need to think about the whole suite of other species. So, and this also, I put this one up focusing on bees, but this is really also emphasizing that importance of seasonality in floral bloom. So for example, you don't necessarily have to memorize the genera, but so for example, Hylaeus, which are masked bees, Augichlora, Augichlorella halictus, Agaposmin laziglossum are different generation or different genera of sweat bees, Ceratina, small carpet bee, bombus, bumblebees. Those species can be found throughout the year, though different species will be prevalent at different times of the year. But as a genus, the entire year is important. When you look at April and May, Osmia, which are the mason bees, they're really only active April, May, when trees and shrubs are often in bloom. And then Melisodes, the longhorn bees, are really those focused on asters, goldenrods, and their relatives, and that's when they are active. So if you do not have these plants, those species will not be present. Now, when we're planting, we often get choices. We look at exotic plants or we can look at native plants. Exotic plants, they're readily available. There's a lot of data on them. They produce large floral displays. The problem is they don't enhance native biodiversity. They can potentially be invasive. And as is the case with a number of species, a good example is the monarch. Our native milkweed, that is what they feed on. So exotic plants are not really going to do it to sustain monarch populations. So native plants enhance native biodiversity. They recreate imperiled habitats. They're less likely to be invasive. They're also adapted to our climate. So as weather changes, they also have the ability to deal with droughts, severe heat, etc. There is unfortunately a greater initial cost, and it can often have a longer establishment time. Additional benefits to native plants, they tend to be sustainable in the environment. So once you get them going, these are perennials, biennials, and even the annuals, which will reseed. They are part of the system, and they will help to sustain that population. By having these natives, you also create a much more diverse ground cover. These native plants also have, in general, much more elaborate and deeper root systems, so they improve erosion control, stabilizing soil. There are a whole variety of native plants, so they can work in diverse ecosystems. And once you get them established, it's very low maintenance. You really don't have to deal with them too often. There are, unfortunately, some obstacles. Most landowners think of them as weeds. This is the one problem we have, particularly with milkweed. It has a bad name. It has the name weed in it, so people immediately think this is a problem. We need to really re-educate people that just because it has that word doesn't mean anything. We can use other names for these species, maybe traditional Native American names, or for example, butterfly weed is often called, or historically has been called pleurisy root because of its medicinal properties. Farmers are often concerned with plants spreading into crop areas. This is particularly the case with common milkweed. This is why they've been working to eradicate it. When you're trying to establish these native plants, people may not notice it. They may not get the full thrill of it. So there's a general phrase which you may hear in regarding establishing native plants. First year it sleeps, second year it creeps, third year it leaps. Now sometimes you can get a good profusion of plants, and this is why I also recommend when you're doing a native planting, put in some initial native annuals so you do have that first year of color, that first year of growth, so that if you are trying to promote it to either an agriculture interest, home gardeners, however you want to do that, so people see that there is something there. And oftentimes it's an education process, getting people to understand those various benefits from soil erosion, diversity of wildlife, making sure people know what the value is of this diverse relationship. Additionally, just as I mentioned with monarchs, where the only food that the caterpillars can feed on are milkweed, we have a lot of other pollinators who are also very specific. This is also work done by Mike Arduzer, formerly Missouri Department of Conservation, and actually probably now needs to be a little bit updated. But here in Missouri alone, we've got 30 families of plants that host oligolectic bees. Oligolectic bees are those which feed on only a few species of plants. So many of these plants, many of these bees are only selecting one family, one genus, and in some very specific cases, only one species. That is the only pollen and nectar that it's collecting for its offspring. For example, here we have several species which are oligolectic specialists on asters, Fabaceae, beans, Silicaceae, the willows. So we have some specialists on willows. So if you do not have these plants, you are not going to be able to support these species. And then one final thought also about the milkweed, as I mentioned, besides being that host plant for monarchs, it is also a great nectar source for bees, and bees are actually the predominant pollinator for milkweed. Though some research, particularly done by Peter Bernhardt at St. Louis University, found that purple milkweed appears to be best pollinated by great spangled fritillary butterflies. But large carpenter bees are the predominant pollinator for common milkweed. But if you have these plantings of milkweed, you're supporting both monarchs, but then also the native bee community as well. But things are changing. We need to be cognizant of environmental changes, and those environmental changes are drastically or can drastically affect that pollinator-plant relationship. So as temperature changes, depending upon how warm it is or cool it is or how long the heat is, that can affect foraging activity by pollinators, whether it be monarchs or bees. That can affect body size and maturity and lifespan. And when we're looking at those issues, particularly body size for monarchs, and we're seeing in some areas where the monarchs actually might be a little bit smaller, that can have an effect on their migration south into Mexico, as well as their survival in Mexico to be able to come back. When we're looking at changes in climate, we change the phenology of certain plants, that they're blooming at a different time than the pollinator may be present, the timing of production of pollen, nectar production. So these plant-pollinator interactions can be very tight. Sometimes they can be fairly general. I've seen plant species that have bloomed a little bit earlier, but it appeared that a good proportion of the native pollinators also merged with them with the heating temperatures, but that is not always going to be the case. So we need to also be cognizant of changes in climate that can affect this relationship. Individuals, researchers like Chip Taylor from Monarch Watch in Kansas has identified that even a change of 2 degrees plus or minus in May, that's Fahrenheit, can affect the entire monarch migration. If it's a little too warm, the plants may precede the butterflies. If it's a little too cold, the plants may be a little bit later than the butterflies. So they can be very sensitive to these temperature changes. But I do want to finish up on one positive note. So that, as you can see, there has been a general decline in monarch populations, particularly since its peak in 96, 97. There's always been a little bit of fluctuation. We saw the lowest point in the winter of 2013 and 2014, a little bit of an uptick. But this last winter of 18-19, we actually had a overwintering population covering over 6 hectares within Mexico. And this is actually our target right now. Excuse me, for a sustainable population, we need to try to make sure that we have at least 7 hectares of overwintering site for these monarchs. So that by looking at this on an annual basis, we can see things happening. But I think one of the reasons why there might have been an uptake, besides possibly weather changes, more and more people are finding that they want to help monarchs. And research that's been showing, how do we help monarchs? Do we put milkweed in agricultural lands, public lands, private lands, homeowners, roadsides, right-of-ways? The only way monarch conservation works is that everybody gets involved. We need to get milkweed on the habitat. So without milkweed, we are not going to have monarchs. So it's incredibly important that everybody gets involved. And there are some additional resources that you can find online to help you identify milkweeds and their habitat. These produced through Xerxes Society Monarch Joint Venture, one on native milkweeds, Central US, I believe there's also some other regions. Milkweed Conservation Practitioner's Guide. And then also the Milkweed Seed Finder through Xerxes to be able to find those seeds, which are incredibly important to be putting out on the habitat. And with that, I hope you've learned a little bit about monarch biology, what the requirements are, and also the relationship that other species have with pollinators. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ed, and thank you all for your interest. For additional information and to access downloadable materials regarding monarch habitat creation, including eco-regional planting guides, please visit pollinator.org/learning center/monarch. I'd also like to encourage you to share information regarding opportunities for citizen scientists to participate in monitoring programs, such as Monarch Joint Venture's Integrated Monarch Monitoring Program, and the new Insight app, which was created by the folks at Border Free Bees in collaboration with Pollinator Partnership and other community organizations to empower citizens to participate in observation-based research. Thank you again.